record to the cloud. We ultimately decided to go with one slide per participant, so it's a bit like a poster, and then each participant is going to give kind of a 60-second elevator speech explaining their research. Because we have 9 sessions and we've got an hour, we can then take kind of 4 to 5 minutes after each poster, take some questions, get some feedback, and then move on to the next presenter. So we'll go ahead and do that. And again, thanks everyone for joining. I'm gonna share my screen and then flip through the various slides and call on the individuals to speak. So I will go ahead and do that now. And we're gonna start with Courtney's presentation. Let me get this queued up here. And Courtney, take it away.
Hi, everyone. So my research poster is called Open Titles, Dispute Resolution Processes for Sustainable Downsizing. And so my research is, in a downsizing scenario, how can workplace dispute resolution systems be coupled with more traditional processes like retraining, transfers, and notice periods for non-union employees to ensure long-term organizational sustainability? We live in a global economy, and outside of the employment relationship, employees wear multiple hats as community members and customers. In order to thrive, employers need to maintain high-quality relationships and embeddedness in the communities in which they operate and serve. From an employee's perspective, downsizing is challenging. Dispute resolution processes offer opportunities to acknowledge unmet needs and emotions of employees. Implementation of this open channel process would require tailoring to the industry and community. There would need to be the appropriate model of dispute resolution, and there also needs to be consideration of the logistical details like venue and facilitator. By combining old and new methods, both employees and employers will have more positive outcomes in the downsizing process.
There we go. And now, please, I think it'll, since we have 9 presentations, saving all the questions for the end, it'd be a little hard to remember the individual ones. So we might as well go ahead and take any questions or comments folks have for Courtney right now. Helen?
I researched arbitration over a long period of time, but I just recently became aware of the statistic that there are about 60 million employees who are subject to arbitration of various disputes. So I think that is an interesting approach that you'll be taking to open it up to more than just labor arbitration, because traditionally I only thought of this as labor arbitration, but there's much, much more.
Yeah, I agree. So when I had started thinking about this, I was actually thinking more about mediation and more of like a facilitated conversation. My background is more mediation. And I had thought about how during those conversations, how could a conversation be had, just because people stick around and there's this competition for talent. So how can relationships be maintained? Ironically, I did not anticipate the coronavirus and the massive downsizing that took place. I worked on this back in November or so. So that was a coincidence. And I feel like through that, there'll be a lot of opportunities to look into what people did and how they did it. I know Airbnb, they didn't do like a mediation or facilitation, but they did work cooperatively with employees as they were doing their layoffs. So it's something interesting that I'll keep looking into.
All right. And any other questions for Courtney on dispute resolution?
Courtney, can I ask a quick question? And Andrew, forgive me, I'm not sure if it's just okay to chime in.
Yeah, just chime in.
Great, thank you. In your research, do you look at particular industries?
So that's when I initially thought about this, I was thinking about the tech industry, just because there will be more manufacturing as well, because there will be a lot of changes due to artificial intelligence, automation, and things like that. But I do think that it would vary depending upon the particular industry, and that's why I mentioned it in there, just considering every industry has their own culture and the way of doing things. And so I think that would be something to look at when figuring this out.
I agree. Just what I was thinking. It almost feels like there would be an interesting historical bent on this, given the changes in manufacturing and the past, I don't know, 25, 30, 40, 50 years.
Exactly. I think that there would be a historical context, and that's why I think part of this would be a case-by-case basis. So I'm going to keep looking into it.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thanks.
Sounds good. All right. Why don't we go on to our second presentation, which is Niti, Pandey.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. So my research is on the historic American whaling industry, and I look at whaling as an organized industrial enterprise that peaked in the mid-19th century before seeing sustained decline and effectively coming to an end in the 1920s, even as global demand for the products of whaling remained high. In spite of the size and impact of the industry on the economy of New England in the 18th and 19th centuries, very little research actually exists on the labor and business aspects of the industry. Workers in this industry experienced unique working conditions, least of which was something known as the lay wage system, and sailors contracted for a fraction of the gross revenue of the voyage, determined by valuing the cargo at current market prices upon docking. So I basically look at several labor market factors as possible explanations for the decline of industry, because there isn't well-established evidence for the anecdotal reasons that have been given for the decline of the industry. And so these include the aspects such as the unique incentives and risks inherent in the lay wage system, supply of labor, competing labor markets, occupational restrictions, and global labor mobility.
Very good. And questions for Niti on whaling as an industry and its labor market implications.
Go ahead, Courtney.
How did you pick whaling? This is such a fascinating industry, and I haven't heard much about it.
Yeah, so I live in Connecticut, and I was researching the early labor movement, so late 1800s, 1900s, and I just happened to go to the Mystic Whaling Museum and went on a tour of the last remaining original whaling ship, the Charles Morgan, and they were talking about this entire economy being built on this industry, and there's no mention of it in any of our labor books, really. And so that's what got me interested and started digging into it. And there's a lot of resources on it here regionally, but a lot of it is inaccessible to researchers in the sense you're probably going to have to spend years sitting in the archives manually decoding all the data into spreadsheets. So I just thought it was a really interesting topic, and seems to be, it's just, the working conditions are very reminiscent of things that we're seeing emerging in our gig economy right now. So, and then the same types of contracts, the same types of treatment of workers, and just transposed 152 years later.
I love that story that you just happened to go to the museum.
Yeah, I was kind of shocked. I said, wow, I want to study this. And so it's such a rare happenstance that you find something so interesting.
Yeah.
Studying. Thanks.
Niti, I'm from Maine, and I was wondering if this was, I really honestly don't know this, was this an industry that was part of the Maine culture as well? And a couple of that question with, did you see overlap with what you found in the whaling industry with modern industry, say lobstering and those sorts of things?
So in terms of whether or not Maine was involved, there was a little bit going out of Maine, but the Buzzards Bay area was primarily the focus of the industry. So really, at the height of it. Even Nantucket died out. It was really New Bedford, Sag Harbor, New London, those parts of the coast that were mostly involved. I haven't really looked into modern fishery industry, and that's a good idea, but I do know that the lay system of wages was never replicated anywhere else until we start seeing the gig work, which essentially is sort of a glorified lay wage system where, you know, you get a part of the profits after the activity is over, kind of thing. But that's a good idea. I could look in the modern fishery too to see what's translated over.
Very good. Let's go on to our third presentation, which is Helen LaVan. Oh, Helen, you're muted.
This is so much different than any other paper or poster session at this meeting that I'm amazed. And what I am doing is trying to discern what various companies are doing with respect to their CSR, corporate social responsibility reporting. And so I looked at, this is a pilot study, and I've gone beyond the pilot, but I looked at 26 of the CSR reports of the best green companies as determined by a Newsweek listing. And I did a content analysis to discern what terms they were communicating, looking for whether they were communicating about their green jobs. And as you can see in the yellow highlighted section, there are no references to a green job in any of the 415,000 words that were analyzed in these 26 reports. And I didn't really expect that there would be no references whatsoever. I was looking to see if there would be at least some proportion. And as my area is really human resources, I was interested in what references these companies made to education. And there were 25 of the 26 reports did that, but getting down to safety, there were only 8 of the 26 reports that mentioned safety at all. Training, 25 of the 26 reports. And the union was mentioned actually in 18 of the reports. This is somewhat of a unique area, and it's certainly not mainstream industrial relations, but it's more a matter of corporate social responsibility communication. And I do have a research stream in that. And I'm thinking that, first of all, more best green company CSR reports need to be analyzed. And from an ethical perspective, we need to see whether there is greenwashing, which means companies engage in certain practices to appear to be more green than they actually are. And it was also suggested in the literature that there be a comparison with companies in their sector that are not considered green according to the US News report. And I've been thinking a lot about the last item on my future directions, and that is we need to look at the analysis of jobs that are actually posted. And I did see that in a session this morning, and they were looking at the Chinese market and how did the applicants compare to the employers. And with content analysis, you're able to get a good handle on what the content is of various documents that might be used in industrial relations. And I just want to mention the,
Helen, we've got to move on pretty quick here.
okay, just one more sentence. The pie chart shows that perhaps these CSR reports are self-serving and that they focus more on production than on the society-centered or employee-centered terms.
All right, and we have time for maybe one
Sorry.
question for Helen.
Sorry,
No worries.
I am looking for a co-author.
All right. Well, I tell you what, let's go ahead to Lifei Chen, our next presenter. Lifei, take it away.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So our research is about union commitment facets, loyalty, responsibility, and willingness, and meta-analysis. So our research goals were to use meta-analysis to examine the covariations between the three major facets of union commitment and external variables such as job satisfaction, union participation, and then we test the constructability of the facets level measurement of union commitment and validity of different theoretical models from previous researches. Although our two models, one model with specification of 3 union commitment facets and another model with specifications of 1 union commitment facet factors, their results are not ideal. We conclude that the 3 facets of union commitment, which are loyalty, willingness to work for union, and responsibility to union, are distinct in the network of union attitude and behavior. So we suggest that future research on union commitment should account for the separate roles of union commitment's 3 dimensions.
Very good. Questions for Lifei on facets of union commitment?
If I may, Lifei, were there differences in different unions, Teamsters versus steelworkers, those sorts of things, or did you look at it from that angle?
Yeah, great question. But for our research, we haven't specified any specific industries. We just pull out over 800 articles and research from previous studies. We did find that some of the research have some inconsistency on the same, variables, but they are in different industry, but we haven't analyzed the differences between each of those industries. But yes, we will look into it very soon. Thank you.
Very good. All right. We move along to Rob Boyle.
Good afternoon, everybody. My poster is about a paper that's a case study, actually, called Craving More: The Influence of a Small Coffee Shop on Social Sustainability. It is a small nonprofit startup in the Tower Grove area of St. Louis. It's housed in an old Lutheran church that was built in 1887 there in the Tower Grove neighborhood. And like a lot of places in the inner city, it fell victim to people fleeing to the suburbs. So it thrived until 1963 when it all but became empty. And it stood that way until 2003 when a couple of visionaries, Phil and Donna Green, got a hold of it, and they decided that putting in a small nonprofit entrepreneurial startup would benefit the community in a variety of ways. I saw 3 ways primarily. That CRAVE represents social sustainability. Number 1, the building. Research I read suggests that buildings can have a significant impact on attitudes and conduct. And that was certainly part of the vision of Phil and Donna Green when they started this. The Value of Place, for those of you who may have read Ray Oldenburg's work, The Great Good Place, which is a terrific book, he talks a lot about the value of place and how they can be social, inclusive, and community oriented. And this is a cornerstone of the mission of Crave Coffee House. And finally, the neighborhood is a great quote from one of the books I used in my research called Life in the Canyon. And that's describing this idea of the demise of American inner cities. And much of what I read and a bit of what I wrote about is this idea that local entrepreneurial ventures can help mitigate some of that.
Great. Questions for Rob about Crave Coffee House and the value of place? Go ahead, Christine.
I'm guessing it was a very good question.
It must have been a good question. Unfortunately, technology has failed us. Any
Christine, why don't you try posting it in the chat?
Yeah, Christine, if you post your question in the chat, I'll read it. You're breaking up. Christine, if you post your question in the chat, unfortunately your audio was breaking up. Any other questions for Rob?
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Is it thought that if more of these were would they be created in other cities to have the same effect? Is that like where they're going with this, or is this just going to be a standalone?
Thank you, Courtney. That's exactly where I'm going with it. So I'm widening this out, and I have so far studied a place called Urban Abbey in Omaha, Nebraska, and Rue Street Cafe, forgive me, I can't remember right now, in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I have designs to continue on to get a sense from other similar nonprofits as to how they impact the neighborhoods.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I tell you what, let's go on to our next presenter is Francois Devete here. Okay, she may not have, I believe I have the audio that.
Cleaners stand in a bad position among all professional groups in terms
cleaners.
of wage and in terms of the perception on their employment, proxied by the answer to the question whether the worker would be happy if her child would choose her occupation. This is the first graph. But we found an important heterogeneity when disaggregating cleaners between occupations, depending on their status, big, private, and if private, in-house or outsource. This is the second graph. We have tested the status, but also their job specialization in cleaning, influence wage and employment perception, sex, age, migration status, and education being controlled. This is the table. Thus, the status of the employee, on the one hand, and the combination of cleaning with other activities such as care, education, or production, on the other hand, improve the quality of these jobs.
Okay. Since Francois is not with us, I'm gonna go ahead and go on to Ben Glasner's presentation.
Hey everyone, my name is Ben Glasner. I'm a PhD candidate in public policy at the Evans School at the University of Washington. This research is focused on the question of how do we identify low-wage workers in administrative data, in particular when we don't have information on the number of hours worked. This is a difficult problem because most administrative data that might be focused on earnings is just going to give us the total quarterly or annual earnings, but no information on how many hours might be worked by that individual. So the identification of low-wage workers, which might be policy relevant, becomes really difficult. What I ended up doing in this study is I replicate the work of Jardim et al. 2018, who studied the effect of the Seattle minimum wage using Washington State Employment Security Department data. This data includes both quarterly earnings and their quarterly hours worked. But I replicate this analysis assuming that we don't actually have information on those hours. I use 3 potential identification strategies for low-wage workers. The first, treating only accommodation and food service industry workers as low-wage. The second, looking solely at limited service restaurants. And the third, using a random forest that's been trained on the actual data, which has identified low-wage workers, but I don't use hours in that identification or training process. The first 2 methods, as we can see, are used pretty often in minimum wage studies, where we say, let's just treat all people involved in accommodation and food services or limited service restaurants as low-wage workers. And we can see in the 2 right side panels that actually ends up leading to not accurate conclusions based off of the observed low-wage workforce, where we're seeing something like the accommodation and food service showing little to no effect on earnings and employment, and limited service restaurants actually showing more dramatic declines. This is different than our top left, which is the actual data where we have information on who is really a low-wage worker. When we use the random forest selection instead, we see something that gets a little bit to that increase in earnings, but no real change in employment effect, but it's still not totally consistent. Broadly, what my paper is kind of concluding is the fact that while machine learning and non-parametric approaches might give us more information, the ability to train and match this ends up becoming very difficult in any circumstance. So non-parametric models and random forests do better than just doing industry classification, but there's still no real substitute to actually having that hours data.
Great. Questions for Ben on the identification of low-wage workers? Ben, I'll start off a question.
Go ahead.
So does your methodology have implications for that Jardine study?
So my method is primarily just seeing how close we can get to the Jardine study, since they actually have the hours data that they can use. And so the Jardine study is kind of with full information, what's the conclusion? Right. Mine is saying if we don't have that and we try and replicate it in something like the LEHD data, or trying to add or generalize to other unemployment insurance-based models that don't have hours, can we get there?
Right. This reminds me of Bob Lalanne's studies of how good instrumental variable this is compared to the actual.
Exactly. This is pretty much a horse race analysis of sorts, saying like, how good can we get?
Other questions for Ben? All right, let's go ahead and move on to Anne Kovalainen, all the way from Finland.
Hi, good evening, everybody. It's midnight in Finland, but we are having the midnight sun here, so that's perfectly fine. Not to take time of my presentation, our paper is At Work Learning Among the Platform Workers. This is a paper between me and my colleague who unfortunately couldn't be present here. We claim that new technologies are driving the constant renewal and update of core skills, especially among the highly skilled employees, irrespective of the employment level or employment type. And these changes challenge especially those workers who face professional complexities and new skills requirements. We've been analyzing the people who work at the platforms and sell their expertise at the platforms. How do they upgrade their skills without permanence of contracts, without direct rewards following from the upskilling, or stability indeed supported by the employer or by the employer organization? We've done a survey on Upwork, one of the global gig selling places, among those workers who have registered in Finland, so they can come from the neighboring countries, but they are selling their expertise globally at platforms and competing globally with experts around the world who mediate expert task gigs. And it seems, according to our analysis, that most workers have no possibilities for systematic upgrading of skills, irrespective of their high qualities of expertise. And for selling their expertise, they can get tips, the kind of marketing tips from their peers and very important informal peer support groups. But that is very performative by nature, so it is related to the ways of selling your skills and not at all the content-related upgrading of skills. And this will, we argue, create a great problem for those who are selling their highly qualified skills, like software developers, designers, translators who are working on these expert gig markets. So thank you.
Very good. And questions for Anne on kind of gig workers and at-work learning? Let's see.
Okay.
And actually, I'd be interested, what data are you using? What?
We did a large survey around among everybody who are registered in Finland selling their expertise in Upwork. We also did a similar survey in Germany among those who work in Germany at Upwork. So it is people who are registered in these specific countries, but they can come from whichever country they are living in.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And the question about which somebody asked in chat about the certain occupations. The occupations were not restricted because Upwork is requiring expertise that you are able to sell. So that usually means you are highly qualified. You are working in those occupations that are sellable at the global market. So not dentists, obviously, but lawyers, translators, software developers, coders, a lot of these types of occupations.
Great. All right. And if there are no more questions for Anne, we can go on to our last presentation from Huirong Zhang. And is Huirong with us, I guess is key question.
He's on here. I just sent him an unmute request.
Okay. Huirong? Whoops. No, I've done it. Huirong, are you with us? Let's see. There we go. Well, I will put Huirong's presentation up about whether having Chinese kind of directors with certain types of experience is helpful. And give folks a chance to read that for a second. And having done that, we actually have a few minutes, unusually enough. So I do this. So I would open it up to questions for any of the presenters. I know, Christine, you earlier had a question that we didn't get to. So feel free to go ahead and ask that, and any question anybody has for any of the poster presenters. But everyone did a very nice job, and like I said, these were a very interesting set of presentations. Helen?
Can I ask Rob a question? Is Crave based on there being a building in need of renovation?
Sort of, Helen. Yeah, so it wasn't the building wasn't, or the owners of the building weren't seeking somebody to do that. It was really these folks that I mentioned who had seen it. The Phil Green owned a construction company. And so when they saw this building, when they happened to be going through St. Louis, they live in Illinois, they had this vision. And so it wasn't, it was them approaching the owners of the building, not vice versa.
Okay. Because I was thinking about, is this a place where workers are trained, unemployed individuals are trained?
Yep. So that's an angle I take. I teach entrepreneurship. That's my primary field. And an angle I take is the benefit that it provides to the young baristas and the young manager that's trained there and the cooks that work there as well, who many of whom are from the neighborhood. So part of that benefit of the neighborhood is the employment and security that it provides and the training.
Because I was thinking about, there's this Inspiration Cafe that there are a couple of different locations, and one was not in a unique building, but a part of urban renewal, kind of, in Uptown in Chicago. And the focus was on training unemployed, sometimes socially challenged individuals in the hospitality sector. So there are some models like that, even in Chicago, that help. Yeah. But it's not really associated with sustaining a building. It's more associated with providing employability.
Yeah, I would say that is an outcome of CRAVE, but not an intentional part of their mission. So a serendipitous outcome of CRAVE is that training and the employment opportunities and security that it provides.
Thank you.
Any questions for any of our presenters?
Christine put one in the chat.
Christine had a similar question for Rob. I can read it. I know she was having some issues asking about building in dimensions of social sustainability into community economic development. But she says you pretty much touched on it in your response to Helen. Anne has a question about Helen's poster. Annual reports are written by PR, and I wonder if the green reports development and writing are following a similar route.
I don't actually know the answer to that, although I've considered it. What's happening in Europe is companies are now being required to issue CSR reports, and I believe there's some standards associated with what has to be in the report. But in some respects, this is a nightmare because some of them are huge, several hundred pages, and some of them that I looked at are minimal, only a few pages long. So it's a communications research nightmare. We had another study on CSR reporting in the pharma sector, and they tend to be more uniform than these reports in green companies because it's not sector specific. But I'm going to take a look at return on assets of the green companies relative to comparable companies that are not considered green, that are in the same SIC code or NACE code as part of this. It's a huge amount of data. It's more data than I've ever dealt with before at one time. But
I have a question on Helen, since you were talking about the green job, and You mentioned very interesting, surprising, observation there. But I'm wondering whether that could relate it to the time effect as well, because that looks like your CSR report data collected in 2017 reports, right? So maybe as a one-time point, it'd be different time, maybe because my impressions green job was very hard about several years ago. There was once really hard, a lot of grants for that. But for the recent years, not necessarily mentioned directly as green, like your report shows the energy could be another mentioning there. So maybe just the terming is at the time. So I'm thinking of if you have the data to check another time point, maybe some other variation, maybe interesting observation there. Just a thought. And I also have a question on Ben. I really like the machine learning, and I handle a lot of administrative data. I fully understand. There's no lacking of hourly information. But could you elaborate a little bit in detail? How did you build your model for the machine learning? What are the assumptions to collect the data? Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So the model itself is built from a combination of, or built from a basis of ESD data, which was for unemployment insurance. And in that data, what I use to train on is both industry classification and quarterly earnings, which I then can also interact with over time. The actual data also includes quarterly hours, which is how you would generally be identifying low-wage workers. But I'm training the data set for the random forest on a dummy saying, is this individual low wage? And using the quarterly earnings and industry as a combined amount of information to predict whether or not that would in fact be a low-wage worker. So the idea would be if we get more confident in these models or take more time to really train them effectively, you could use that same information into other data sets that don't have hours and predict low-wage workers often when trained on a data set that does have hourly available data. This would be ideal if we were trying to do something like analyses of low-wage workers or any type of hourly worker or hour policy in states that might not be collecting hours data. The random forest itself, do you want me kind of like expand more on the actual method of random forest or just kind of what the training specifications were?
Maybe we can talk offline. I don't want to waste everybody else's time.
Yeah, sure.
Unless people are not interested. But quickly, I know the regular, like your Washington data, the wage record has also limitation on you do not know at what point there could be work one day, as the quarterly wage. But in your calculators, that will become a low wage. Actually, they're not actually low wage. They could just a partial quarter earnings. So how did you treat that? Just quickly on that.
Yeah, so it's possible that someone might be working for part of the quarter as opposed to the full quarter stint, but they'd still be recording for their quarterly earnings and quarterly hours. So even if they work part of the quarter, we'd still have the number of hours they worked per earnings. So we can still get the low wage for partial quarter employment. Where we end up running into some issues are things like merging multiple job holders. How do we calculate the hours across jobs for different quarterly leavings and starting dates? And we end up with a little bit of uncertainty as workers kind of transition between jobs in the data set, which is something that the random forest we can code for. So I also include identifiers in the random forest training for multiple job status, whether a person leaves that firm in that quarter or the next quarter, and try and add just more information there. The primary reason why we think the random forest might be good for these types of things is because we're allowing for the non-parametric approach. It can interact those things together and just use as many interactions as it feels is comfortable to explain the data, and we just kind of do the hands-off approach. It ended up outperforming logistic and OLS models when trying to do that exact type of prediction. But I'd be happy to talk off this as well further if you're interested.
That's great. I think that's a great place to wrap up. These were all really great sessions, and I'm eager to read, frankly, the papers coming out of all of these posters. So thank you, everybody, for participating, and sure we'll see you all around in sessions over the next few days.